morning, Shabbat Shalom. Today our Torah portion is the beginning of Exodus. It's Parashat Shemot, which means names. Let's go ahead and start with a blessing. Blessed are you, Yehovah our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and has commanded us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. Please, Yehovah our God, sweeten the words of Torah in our mouth and in the mouth of your people, for the family of Israel. May we and our offspring and the offspring of your people, the house of Israel, all of us know your name and study your Torah for its own sake. Blessed are you, Yehovah, who teaches Torah to his people Israel. All right, we're going to play the Tony Robinson game. That's what I have. That's what I've named it. I have a few words or phrases that I found in this Torah portion, and I'm going to challenge you guys to find where in the Torah portion I found those. So we're going to see how well you all studied. The first one is increased abundantly. Who can tell me where I found that in the Torah portion? Yes. 1:7. Excellent. And 1:7 says, the descendants of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly. All right, the next one is turn aside. Where does it talk about turning aside in this Torah portion? I know some of you guys can skim through pretty fast, so someone will find it eventually. Chapter 3, verse 3. Would you go ahead and... Yeah. Yeah, 3:3 says, Moshe said, I'm going to go over and see this amazing sight and find out why the bush isn't being burned up, or he's going to turn aside and see the bush, depending on your translation. The next one, it talks about paying close attention or visiting you and seeing. Where's that discussed in this? Lori?
3:16.
Very good.
Yeah, I've been paying close attention to you.
Excellent. So where in this Torah portion does it talk about anger? Yes, 4:14. It says, at this, Yehovah's anger blazed up against Moshe. And the last one we're going to do, it talks about obedience or to obey. I'll give you a hint. It's in chapter 5. Yes. Yep, Mike found it. But Pharaoh replied, who is Yehovah that I should obey? All right, let's go ahead and start. We're going to read through the sections and then go ahead and comment on those. Do I have a volunteer to read the first section? The first section is Exodus chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. Any volunteers to read? All right. Exodus chapter 1, verse 1 through 17.
Yellow. Hey, it's me. Now, these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin. Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all the generations. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, and multiplied and waxed exceedingly. Mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto the people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it come to pass that when we falleth out of any war, they join also unto our enemies, fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. They were grieved because of the children of Israel, and the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter and hard bondage in mortar and in brick and in the manner of service in the field, and all their service, wherein they made them serve, was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other was Puah. And he said, When you do the office of the midwife to the Hebrew woman, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men alive, or saved the men, children alive. Did I read too far?
No, that was right there. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. Does anyone have any comments on this section? Yes.
The name Puah is a Egyptian name. It's attested in Egyptian sources. And so this section of Exodus has a lot of loanwords from Egyptian at the time of Moses.
Does anyone else have any comments? No, I noticed when I was reading this that it starts out and it really kind of brings light back to the covenant that God made with Abraham. It starts out with the names of the children of Israel, of Israel's sons. So it's bringing up who the covenant is for, who the subjects of the covenant are. And all throughout this section, there's covenant language in there. It talks about the Pharaoh in Egypt dying and the new Pharaoh coming who didn't, let's see, where's it at here? It talks about him not remembering Joseph. And that's covenant language there. It's not that he forgot who Joseph was, but he was choosing not to honor the promises that were made to Joseph from the previous pharaohs. Yes, Tom?
So, I can't remember what book it's in. Maccabees or one of the books that got canonized. But how exactly the Pharaoh set about to get control of the men of Goshen, or the Israelites, is pretty interesting, right? Because if you read this first opening, he comes across a little bit as a doofus, right? Expecting women to murder babies for him is a little odd, right? So that seems somewhat unwise. However, if you read the strategy that they used when they were building those two cities, they built those treasure cities primarily to create isolation and to get the men away from their homes. And that really is what established this form of socialism, which turned into communism in that community. It's very interesting, if you want to read it.
So, Tom, in that same light, in verse 6, that word increased abundantly is also the same word, Hebrew word for swarmed. So that takes us back to creation, right? Genesis 1, the swarmed. And so you see that instead of considering them as humans, they consider them as beast. However, you think about how many people are numbered here and how many left, and how they were, like you said, they may have been trying to do that. There's also the custom that they had to pay their taxes by working for the king.
I'd also like to add that there is a progression here. I think that's one of the things that Tom was pointing out, which parallels anti-Semitism. We see that, of course, with, in Germany with Hitler. So with this progression that's going, he starts off, and keep in mind, too, that surely at this point, because of Joseph himself, Pharaoh owns almost all of Egypt anyway, right? So he has a great deal of power anyway, but he starts off with his reasonable accommodation here, and he slowly ramps it up. You see the progression here, ramps it up. And recently, Joanne and I have been going to a class on the Shoah, on the Holocaust in Fort Wayne. And one of the sessions, they pointed out that there's an exhibit in Berlin, in the Bavarian quarter of Berlin, that has 80 different signs on street lamps. And one side of it has a picture that kind of describes what's on the other side. And the other side is one little rule that applied to the Jews and no one else. And it went on and on from there. They kept getting progressively. They referenced a date and for all of these. And so it was a process that went by as well. So we see here, it wasn't immediately that they just started throwing these babies into the Nile, right? Okay.
Yeah, it's like with everything, it's a slippery slope. You take one step and that becomes the status quo, and then you add another and another.
In 1:10, where it says, the descendants of Israel become too powerful, so come, let us use wisdom. So we're talking about the Egyptian belief that they are wise and how they're going to deal with them. But then later on, it discusses in 12, but the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more they multiplied and expanded until the Egyptians came to dread the people of Israel and worked them relentlessly. And in Deuteronomy 2:25, the Lord had said, today I am going to start making the nations of the earth dread you, and they will come to have fear and terror of your name. And this has gone out through history. So I just was contrasting the wisdom of the Egyptians and their decisions.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how whenever man tries to use their own wisdom against God, it always kind of backfires. And he says that our ways are not his ways. Does anyone else have anything? Yeah. I think it was the book of Jubilees. Jubilees? Okay. Okay. Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and read the next section. It's chapter 1:18 through verse 2:10. If I can have a volunteer to read that. Yes, Becky. through chapter 2, verse 10.
Okay. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this, and let the male children live?" The midwife said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river bank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moshe, because, she said, "I drew him out of the water."
Thank you. Does anyone have any comments on this section? Yes.
Thank you. Where the midwives answered Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women aren't like us, that is set up a pattern for all of humanity that when, in my belief, in my opinion, when we are like getting ready to step into our calling or birthing our calling, Satan has a ferocious attack against us. And that is supported by Revelation 12:4. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of heaven and threw them down to earth. It stood in front of the woman about to give birth, so that it might devour the child in the moment it was born. And so just for me, I think that's Satan's been doing that forever, really, against us.
Yeah, I would agree that's kind of his MO. Yes, Stevie?
I think it's fascinating that God uses Pharaoh's own household, his own daughter, to bring deliverance to the people. So I think that's it's justice.
Mike?
Yeah, and just to test the fact that Yahweh says that he with the hearts of kings, he moves them, like a rudder does a ship to accomplish his own purposes, and so he has his way. One of the things that was interesting, why did Pharaoh's daughter, who she obviously knew the command of Pharaoh, why did she say, take this child in? Well, it goes back to the knowing the ancient Near East culture and their theology, and in many of the pagan cultures, they believed that the judgment was done through the depths of the water, and just to make it short, that if you were deemed guilty, you would be to challenge to determine if you were. The person would be tied up, and the accuser, based on what the accuser said, you'd be thrown in the water, depths of the water. And if you died, then that to them meant that God's judged that person guilty. But if the person survived, then that meant to them their gods judged them as innocent. So Pharaoh's daughter, with that theology, understood that, hey, the gods have judged this baby boy innocent, and therefore had to, by obligation of their own theology, take this child in. So that's just something interesting in understanding the culture and why they did what they did here. And you can see that pattern throughout, the flood with Noah, the Israel going through the Red Sea when it was parted, and by the waters coming over Pharaoh's army, that told the Egyptians we were guilty, and the Israelites were innocent.
And I think you see that pattern of in cultures of cultural innocence, if they've gone through that test all through history, whether it's back in the Roman days with trial by combat, or even people that survive hangings or firing squads or whatever. If they've survived what's deemed the judgment, then they're deemed innocent, and you see that throughout history.
In Egyptian society at the time, high-class women were very independent and free-thinking and expressed themselves independently of their own authorities, much like some women are today. They view themselves as autonomous, and the root of that word means self-law. So they viewed themselves as independent from authority. And I might say about the name Moshe for Moses, it comes from a loanword from Egyptian. Moshe in Egyptian at the time meant drawn out, as you can see from the text. It did not exist in Egyptian society or in Hebrew society until he was born.
Mike, hearing you talk about the water and judgment, it made me think of, I think it's in Numbers 5, where the woman caught in adultery has to drink the bitter water. Is that related? That he used water to determine innocence? I don't know. It just made me think about it.
All right, one last comment on this. I know I'm harping on it, but I think it pertains to us today because we saw some of this with COVID and things like that. So the Pharaoh gets smarter, right? And he says, well, forget having the midwives do this. Let's just have everyone do it to one another. So when he says, he assigns all his people. Well, that was Hebrews too, right? So you could turn on your neighbor, and you got pretty much a king's ransom for turning in your neighbor. So it was not only dividing the Hebrew nations from Egypt, it was dividing the Hebrew nations itself. So he got pretty clever pretty fast for the amount of money. And I don't know how I know this or where I heard this, but it was an equivalent of today's money, around $200,000. Right, so this could shift just who you might turn against secretly, right? So that's how evil operates, right? It divides. However, in God's greatness, if you're going to divide households, he divided Pharaoh's household, right? So everybody gets the same treatment, and Pharaoh got the same treatment, so.
Concerning the bitter waters that the woman was made to drink to determine her guilt or innocence, I think it's connected to also to the in Revelation when after the seventh angel had sounded, and all things were about to be fulfilled. it mentions there in verse, let's see. Well, maybe it talks about the one who had taken the book, and the angel said, "Take and eat, and it shall be make thy belly bitter, but it shall be in thy mouth sweet as honey." And I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it up, and it was in my mouth sweet as honey. And as soon as I had eaten it, my belly was bitter, and said unto me, "Thou must prophesy again before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings." So it almost like this is a prophecy of for those that accept the words of the book, it's sweet. But for those that don't, the judgment that's coming will be very bitter. So it may be connected also to this here.
Thematic connections. All right. Anyone else before we move on to the next section? All right. I need a volunteer to read Exodus 2, verse 11 through 2, verse 25. Yeah. You want to read? All right. Chapter 2, verse 11 through 2, verse 25.
In those days when Moses had grown up, he went out to his brothers and saw their burdens. He saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his brothers. He looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He went out the second day, and behold, 2 men of the Hebrews were fighting with each other. He said to him who did the wrong, "Why do you strike your fellow?" He said, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you plan to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses was afraid and said, "Surely this thing is known." Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and lived in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. When they came to Reuel, their father, he said, "How is it that you have returned so early today?" They said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and moreover, he drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him that he may eat bread." Moses was content to dwell with the man. He gave Moses Zipporah his daughter. She bore a son and named him Gershom, for he said, "I have lived as a foreigner in a foreign land." In the course of those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed because of the bondage, and they cried. And their cry came up to God because of the bondage. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the children of Israel, and God understood.
Does anyone have any comments on this section?
On the earlier section, there might be question how the Pharaoh's daughter knew that the boy was Hebrew. First of all, he was circumcised, and the Egyptians did not circumcise their males. And secondly, he was probably covered with a blanket, a baby blanket, just like you do today. All fabrics back then were woven by hand, not by machines as they are today. Hand-woven fabrics often have a particular weave and color pattern, and that would be distinctive of Hebrew weaving and not Egyptian weaving.
Yes. Very good. Anyone else? It really struck me the last verse of this chapter And kind of at the beginning, I mentioned the covenant language in this section, and it really comes out in verse 23, 24, and 25 again in this section. In verse 24, it says, God heard their groaning as the people of Israel cried out. And the word that's used there is Shema. And, you know, we all hear Shema and we think, Hear, O Israel. And the meaning that we assign to that as English-speaking people is to hear and to obey. But thinking of God shemaing to the people of Israel as they cried out, he heard their cries, and he was going to obey that because of the covenant that he had set to them. He was going to keep to his word. And also he remembered his covenant. It straight up says that he remembered his covenant, but it's not like he forgot his covenant. It's more that he's going back to all of the details that he gave to them and saying, I have heard you. I am going to keep to these details, every single one of them that I gave to you. And I see you. I see you in your suffering. I see where you're at, and I'm coming for you. So, yeah, Donnie?
I didn't get to share this earlier, but I thought it was pretty interesting how Moses' birth parallels Yeshua's birth. So Moses, the rabbis say, when he was born, there was the light that filled the room, and also that Pharaoh's astrologers noticed that there was a star for a redeemer in the sky. So it kind of parallels Yeshua's birth, and he, like Yeshua, would follow the same pattern as a redeemer for Israel. Just a thought there.
Yeah, there's no end of parallels between Moses and Yeshua for sure. Yeah, Stevie?
I was just reflecting on your insight about Shema, and it occurred to me as well that Ishmael, his name means man who heard Ishmael's name, and Ishmael was trained by Abraham as his son for even up to the time when he had his own mitzvah. So anyway, there's no reason to suppose that he did not enact much of what he learned in his life to his own family and to his sons and to the nations that came out of his loins. And I also refer, that's probably also true of Esau as well. Yeah. So it should not be surprising to us to reflect that the Arabs, the Muslim descendants, practice circumcision.
Right, I agree. Anyone else? Yeah.
Donnie had pointed out, I was looking at some of my notes, there's actually 3 chiastic structures in this, and the focus being the narrative of Israel's oppression, Moses' birth and calling, and the promise of the redemption. And he pointed out that's Moses and Yeshua, the birth of Yeshua, but also in the end, Israel is oppressed, and then he comes for the final redemption, and we know that it's coming closer and closer every day.
And verse 25 ends that God knew Israel, and that knew is, again, covenant language. It's like a husband knows a wife. It's an intimate knowing. It's I want to pursue a relationship with you. I want to pursue you. I want you to be mine. And anybody else? All right, let's go ahead and read the next section. If I can get a volunteer, it's chapter 3, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 15. Thank you.
Now Moshe was tending the sheep of Yitro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. Leading the flock to the far side of the desert, he came to the mountain of God, to Horeb. The angel of Adonai appeared to him in a fire blazing from the middle of a bush. He looked and saw that although the bush was flaming with fire, yet the bush was not being burned up. Moshe said, I'm going to go over and see this amazing sight and find out why the bush isn't being burned up. When Adonai saw that he had gone over to see, Adonai called to him from the middle of the bush, Moshe, Moshe. He answered, Here I am. He said, Don't come any closer. Take your sandals off your feet, because the place where you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father, he continued, the God of Abraham, the God of Yitzhak, and the God of Yaakov. Moshe covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. Adonai said, I have seen how my people are being oppressed in Egypt and heard their cry for release from their slave masters, because I know their pain. I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that country to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the place of the Canaani, Hitti, Amori, Perizzi, Hivi, and Yevusi. Yes, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have seen how terribly the Egyptians oppressed them. Therefore, now, come, and I will send you to Pharaoh so that you can lead my people, the descendants of Israel, out of Egypt. Moshe said to God, Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? He replied, I will surely be with you. Your sign that I have sent to you will be that when you have led the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moshe said to God, Look, when I appear before the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What am I to tell them? God said to Moshe, Ayeh asher ayeh, I am, will be what I am, will be, and added, here is what to say to the people of Israel. I am, or I will be, has sent me to you. God said further to Moshe, say this to the people of Israel, Yod-He-Vav-He, Adonai, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Yitzhak, and the God of Yaakov, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is how I am to be remembered, generation after generation.
Yeah, there's a lot in this section. Does anyone have any comments? I like the fact reading this that Moses didn't go looking for God. God went looking for Moses. And I think there's everywhere you look, God is our Redeemer. He's always looking for us. And a question that I had that as we were reading, I didn't think of this when I was studying for this week, but it hit me as we were reading the last section. When Moses was back at the well, all of the girls came back to their father, and they call him Reuel, their father, and he married Zipporah, Reuel's daughter. But in chapter 3, they call him Yitro or Jethro. So why does he have two names? Donnie?
Well, he spoke 10 different languages. No, it was that a name in the Bible represents character. So during a passage where it's representing a certain character of him, it's going to use that name that reflects character, just like we have different names that reflect our different character. So Reuel here is one who's seen God. That's the name of that's his name right here. But in another passage where it's Jethro, it is Yitro, because the Hebrew is to add, yater, to extend. Because this man has an extra passage, a chapter in the book of Exodus, where he tells Moses how to structure Israeli government. And because of that, he added, yatar, a book to the Torah. So that's just who he is. Also, like I said, names are a person's character.
And that kind of dovetails into how God answered Moses when Moses said, who am I to tell you? Who am I to tell them that you are? And he says, I am who I am. And that's him saying he's going to let his character speak for himself. Yeah. Donnie?
And I am who I am literally in Hebrew is I will be who I will be. So it's a promise also.
Anyone else? There's also reading in there when God's telling Moses to go and see Pharaoh, Moses responds with, who am I? Why am I able to do this? And God doesn't respond back to Moses saying, I'm calling you to do this because you're really good in this area, because you excel at this other thing. God says, I'm going to be with you. And that's how he answers Moses. And it reminds me of a quote that I read the other week that says that when God calls us to do something, he keeps in mind how stupid we are. So he already takes that into account. All right. Do I have a volunteer to read chapter 3, verses 16 through chapter 4, verses 17? Yeah, Sivi?
I liked your comment about God knows how stupid we are.
It's very fitting for me, that's for sure.
Go, gather the leaders of Israel together and say to them, Jehovah, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, has appeared to me and said, I've been paying close attention to you and have seen what is being done to you in Egypt. And I have said that I will lead you up out of the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanite, Hitti, Amori, Prizzi, Hivi, and Yevusi, to a land flowing with milk and honey. They will heed what you say, then you will come, you and the leaders of Israel, before the king of Egypt, and you will tell him, Jehovah, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Now please, let us go 3 days' journey into the desert so that we can sacrifice to Jehovah our God. I know that the king of Egypt will not let you leave unless he's forced to do so. But I will reach out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders that I will do there. After that, he will let you go. Moreover, I will make the Egyptians so well disposed toward this people that when you go, you won't go empty-handed. Rather, all the women will ask their neighbors and house guests for silver and gold jewelry and clothing with which you will dress your own sons and daughters. In this way, you will plunder the Egyptians. Chapter 4. Moshe replied, I am certain they won't believe me, and they won't listen to what I say, because they'll say, Jehovah did not appear to you. Jehovah answered him, what is that in your hand? And he said, a staff. He said, throw it on the ground. And he threw it on the ground, and it turned into a snake, and Moshe recoiled from it. Then Jehovah said to Moshe, put your hand out and take it by the tail. He reached out with his hand and took hold of it, and it became a staff in his hand. This is so that they will believe that Jehovah, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Yitzhak, and the God of Yaakov, has appeared to you. Furthermore, Jehovah said to him, now put your hand inside your coat. He put his hand in his coat, and when he took it out, his hand was leprous, as white as snow. Then God said, "Now put your hand back in your coat." He put his hand back in his coat, and when he took it out, it was as healthy as the rest of his body. If they won't believe you or heed the evidence of the first sign, they will be convinced by the second. But if they aren't persuaded, even by both these signs, and still won't listen to what you say, then take some water from the river and pour it on the ground. The water you take from the river will turn into blood on the dry land. Moshe said to Jehovah, "Oh, Jehovah, I'm a terrible speaker. I always have been, and I'm no better now, even after you've spoken to your servant. My words are slowly. My tongue moves slowly." Jehovah answered him, "Who gives a person a mouth? Who makes a person dumb or deaf, keen-sighted or blind? Isn't it I, Jehovah? Now, therefore, go. I'll be with your mouth, and will teach you what to say." But he replied, "Please, Lord, send someone else, anyone you want." At this, Jehovah's anger blazed up against Moshe. He said, "Don't you have a brother, Aaron, the Levi? I know that he's a good speaker. In fact, here he is now coming out to meet you, and he'll be happy to see you. You will speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be your mouth and his, teaching you both what to do. Thus he will be your spokesman to the people. In effect, for you, he will be a mouth, and for him, you will be like God. Now, take this staff in your hand because you need it to perform the signs."
We just have a few minutes left. Yeah, Donnie, do you have something?
I promise I'll shut up after this. First of all, the snake, the Hebrew literally calls it a crocodile. So if you wonder why Moses' staff was able to vanquish Pharaoh's staffs, it's because he threw down a crocodile. You can imagine how terrified you'd be if you threw down your rod. And because the normal word in Hebrew for snake is nachash, but in this case it's used a tanin, which is a crocodile. Now the translators are like, we can translate it a serpent because tanin can also be a really big serpent, but in this case, picture something more the size of a crocodile, something as ferocious as that. So, that's one note. Another note, let's talk about the speech for a second. Because Moses, there's different debates how he ended up with a speech impediment. He says, his tongue is heavy and his lips are heavy. Literally, if you do a little bit of study on this, you'll find that the rabbis talk about how he had trouble pronouncing and distinguishing with words you use your teeth for, think T, Z letters, and also trouble distinguishing sounds, digraphs that you make with the lips. So he struggled with his lips and also manipulating his tongue and his mouth. And if you're going to be the spokesperson, also keep in mind, you're the spokesperson in the holy language of Hebrew. And God gives you a command, right? You change one letter, you change the message of the word. And people can't understand. So he's saying, I'm not a man of any words, devarim. You go to the book of Deuteronomy. What's Deuteronomy in Hebrew? Devarim. These are the words. Because God filled Moses with an anointing, when Moses spoke with the anointing and power that God gave him, he was able to not speak with a speech impediment. And God, because of that anointing, gave him the power to have words. He was not a man of words by himself. Just a thought there.
Yeah, we're really not much by ourselves without God, are we?
Here's a complimentary comment. Actually, I have two comments, but regarding when Moses says, "I'm heavy of mouth," he stuttered, and he was embarrassed as a stutterer to go before the king of Egypt. We know that because speech is a left brain activity, but singing is a right brain activity. When people who have a problem with stuttering sing, they don't stutter. For example, if you saw the movie The King's Speech, where the King of England, who stuttered at the time of World War II start, had to speak to the nation in his own voice. He knew that he would stutter if he spoke without training, so he hired an unorthodox speech therapist who played loud music in the background, which helped move his speech over to the right side of his brain as he listened to the music. Of course, the therapist did not know that, but scientists today know that. So, for example, at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses sings a whole chapter of scripture. The reason he sang it was he would not stutter. But in ordinary speech, he would stutter. And there are some passages, even in the speeches given to Pharaoh, where Moses himself speaks. So he has lost that fear or embarrassment of stuttering. The second point I want to make is in the verse that says, where God says, "Have I not created?" And he lists several, the mute, the deaf, the blind, and in other words, God is perfectly comfortable accepting responsibility for what we perceive as part of the evil in the world by creating some people right out of the womb who cannot speak or cannot hear or are blind or other problems, missing limbs not caused by drugs like thalidomide or other problems that are caused by human faults instead of birth from the womb. But he's perfectly comfortable accepting responsibility for the way the world is, and that when human sins are not involved.
Thank you. We are out of time, so we're going to close. I want to end with one of the thoughts that I had out of this. When Moses is responding to God, he's really worried about how the people are going to respond when he does what God asks him to do. And God pretty much answers him and says, "You just worry about doing what I ask you to do, and I'll worry about the rest." So let's go ahead and close with a blessing. Blessed are you, Yehovah our God, King of the universe, who has given us a Torah of truth, implanting within us eternal life. Blessed are you, Yehovah our God, who gives us the Torah. Thank you all for good conversation this morning.